It will also be the review that we will have for the AP exam for ecology. So you have the first and the second, and that was our last unit for the AP exam. I am going to present the screen now, and you can view this both at the Edpuzzle, but also if you want to be able to pause, it is available on the YouTube channel. All right. So the topics in this is community ecology, biodiversity, and disruptions to the ecosystem. Community, if you remember, are all the living things in a given area and their interactions. So we did quite a bit with confidence interval bars and determine whether sample means are statistically different. So remember, if they are non-overlapping, that means that the sample means are statistically different and with a 95% confidence interval. If they are overlapping, that means the sample means are not statistically different. Predict the cause, effect, change, or disruption to one or more components in a biological system that's based on data. So these are things like the invasive species, global climate change, artificial eutrophication. We covered those all in class. I'm going to go over a few, but remember, you should be reviewing as well with your notes that you took in class. Math was the Simpson Index, and we did that with the model and the Simpson Index with the beads, and we did some practice calculations with that. I felt fairly confident on the Simpson's Index, but you can find a bunch of tutorials on it. Just make sure that they're using the same formula, not the reciprocal. All right, so how we measure and describe a structured community, we look at the species composition. So we're identifying all the different organisms that make up the community, and we're looking at that species diversity, number of different species in the community. And we want to look at species abundance as well. So you can look at a zoo, it has lots of diversity, but you don't have the numbers for each type of species, and that makes it a less healthy community. You really want to have that diversity and abundance to have a healthy community. We measure using that Simpson Diversity Index. So it's looking at that species richness, number of different species, and then the relative abundance, how many of each species. And the more diverse the community, the healthier it is, because it can withstand changes better. If an organism goes on the decline in that community, there is something else that can take over that spot. So for instance, when chestnut trees were wiped out of most of our forests, our deciduous forests here, you had other trees that could take up that spot, like oak trees, and provide the food for the animals. So it was able to withstand that change, the community. We didn't have a collapse of that. And it makes it more resistant to invasive species, which we have been seeing on increasing over time. So this is the formula you want to make sure you use, okay? So you have the total number of organisms of a particular species. So for each species you have to do this. You divide it by the total number of all the species, and then you square root it. You do this for each and every single species, and then you have your epsilon here, which means sum of, you add those together and you subtract it from 1. A high diversity index, closer to 1, that means a greater biodiversity. It's a healthier community. It's going to be more resistant to change and invasive species. A lower one is less biodiverse, and that puts out a higher risk. Okay. We have a number of interactions between populations. So you have competition, so you're going after the same resources. You have predation, so predator-prey, and that boom and bust cycle we talked about. Mutualism, where they both benefit. So if you go back to the PowerPoint that is in the Ecology Drive, you'll see we went through a bunch of different mutualisms that you need to know. So mycorrhizae, the fungus that wraps around the roots of trees, that is going to increase the absorption of water and minerals, and the trees give it sugar. Lichen, which is a fungus Ascomycota, and either a green algae or cyanobacteria. So the green algae or cyanobacteria do photosynthesis, they provide sugar. And then the ascomycota, it's breaking down either a rock or the bark of a tree, which is, and it's going to pick up those nutrients. E. coli in your large intestines make you vitamin K. You provided food in a habitat. So there is, and rhizobium. Definitely know rhizobium. That's a bacteria that is in the legumes, not legumes as in vegetables, legumes as in bean plants. They have nodules. And so they can pick up the nitrogen gas of rhizobium and eventually turn it into, or help turn it into nitrates, which is the form that plants pick up from the soil. And they get food and a place to live in the plant. Commensalism, one benefits, the other is neither harmed nor helped. This one gets a little tricky because we may not always see what that interaction is completely, because we're seeing it through our lens. So this is a description of each of them. And here's your predator-prey. I would always remember in terms of, again, those boom and bust cycles. So here you see there is less prey. We have this increase in snowshoe hare. And then the lynx increases as a result. That causes the collapse. There's less food competition with the snowshoe hare, which is an intra specific interaction. So because they're competing less, they have more offspring, increase in them. Because there's more food available, increase in lynx, and you have that constant cycle up and down. Competitive exclusion principle, this is Gauss's experiment, and this is one of the virtual labs that we will try to do. Not this week because we're kind of having a soft intro, but two organisms cannot have the exact same ecological niche. Okay, so we have, if we put these two paramecium, these are protists, we've talked about them before with the contractile vacuoles, and if we have them in separate cultures, you can see they show that nice logistic growth curve, right? So again, use the environment, exponential growth, then it levels off like carrying capacity, but they're doing quite well. But if I put them in a combined culture, this one, the caudatum, I think I'm saying that correctly, it is going to decrease. It does not outcompete the other paramecium. So there's a couple ways around it. One is resource partitioning, and another is character displacement. So in resource partitioning, I like this because you can see all the different warblers. We looked at it with the lizards in the rainforest, but here you see all the different warblers are using slightly different parts of the trees to get their food, right? So they're avoiding direct competition for food between them. And so we also see this with fundamental niches everywhere. So these warblers could live everywhere. Okay, just like these barnacles can live everywhere. Okay, on here, and these warblers are everywhere on the tree. That is your niche potential. But when you have competition, you get what's called the realized niche, or where you actually live. And so here you see the barnacles are only here, the warblers are only in certain parts of the tree. We also see character displacement. So this causes a parent population to diverge. And so we talked about adaptive radiation, but we also see on the Galapagos Islands that finches where their niches overlap, they tend to actually have go to one extreme or the other of their particular phenotype, okay? So we are actually seeing a shift. So here we see on Los Hermanos Island, this is the size of the beaks. And then this species of finches on Daphne major, this is the size of the beaks. But when they share an island, they have it overlapping, we're seeing a shift, a directional move, either to this side, a smaller one, or with the other finch here to a larger one, okay? So it's kind of emphasizing those differences beyond the beak size here. Dominant versus keystone dominant species. So the chestnut, that was covered by the chestnut blight here in the North America, used to be a dominant species. It had a lot of biomass. but it wasn't necessarily having the greatest influence. It could be replaced. Keystone species do not have to exert a strong control on the community structure. They exert, strong control on the community structure by their ecological niches. So if you remove them, a community can collapse or be drastically changed. So it's like a keystone and arch. If you move that center stone, the whole arch collapses in the building. So bears, they're really important. They eat salmon, and that's going to add those nutrients back into the soil. That completely changes the environment there, makes it much healthier. Prairie dogs, they aerate the soil, and they actually keep down the brush and the undergrowth. There's a really good documentary from Nature, if you want to look up on PBS, if it's still available online, free, on the Serengeti rules. Really does a nice job going through some other examples of keystone species. It's about 50-something minutes. Trophic cascades, we looked at this with that short film on Yellowstone, reintroducing wolves. So what we saw is the removal of the wolves drastically changed the ecosystem, because now the herbivores could, especially the deer, they could overpopulate, and that changed the producers, which changed the insects, which changed actually the river. So we're going above community structure here, going into ecosystem. And then when they added the wolves back in, you could see that drastic change again. All right, you had healthier communities. It had a lot more species diversity, more plants. All right. And if you want to relook at that film, it was really short. I think it was like under 10 minutes. That is available on HHMI Biointeractive. Right. Disruptions of ecosystems. The science practices here are using data to evaluate a hypothesis or prediction, including rejection or failing to reject a null hypothesis, and then the opposite, the second point I have up here, that's to supporting or refuting alternative hypothesis. So whether it's the null or the alternative hypothesis. And just remember, evolution is impacting the community structure and thus ecosystems. So populations evolve due to environmental pressures and random mutations that adds a new variation. So you have that environmental pressure, and that's going to kind of put whether that mutation is going to become an adaptation, that new variation, or if it's a disadvantage and it's going to end up not being represented in that population. So if it is an adaptation, so it's an advantageous genetic variation, that's what's going to be selected for natural selection, okay? And it's for that environment. Invasive or introduced species, these are either intentionally brought over, sometimes people bring them over as pets. We saw the film clip from CBS this morning where they went over, for instance, the Asian carp and the kudzu. I believe they also did zebra mussels there, but there's a number of different examples, unfortunately quite a few. And so they're introduced to the ecosystem and they exploit the new niche free of predators and competition. They often outcompete the native organisms. And so you have this uncontrollable population growth. So it's going kind of up that exponential growth curve, and it changes the community structure and the ecology. All right, so they really do, as a huge problem, it decimates native communities, and in some cases, you don't have that community structure. You have these monocultures. So you saw that with the Asian carp. It's killing off all the native fish, now competing them. But now you got this one fish, and that's a huge problem. You don't have that redundancy within your community. All right, so introduction of new diseases that can devastate native species as well. So we have the Dutch elm disease. It killed off about 75% of the elm trees within 59 years, starting around 1930. It was introduced here, if I'm remembering correctly, around 1910. The potato blight in Ireland, you've studied this probably in your social studies classes. It was due to a fungus, and it decimated the culture, or it decimated the potatoes of Ireland, and people either died or people emigrated. And I believe, if I'm remembering my facts correct, so don't quote me on it, I think it's like a decrease of 20 or 25% of the Irish population due to this. And that's why we want to avoid monocultures. We've seen that with the banana, the Mikey banana. We're seeing currently a fungus decimating the banana culture as well because it's monoculture. And then smallpox, they believe it could have wiped out up to 90% of Native Americans. The reason for that is in Europe, people were often on farms, and if you remember the story of Jenner and the cowpox, and so they think it didn't decimate quite as much the population because they had already been exposed to it. But with cowpox in Europe, but in Native America, they had never been exposed to it or to cowpox. Other things did cause this, so things like the flu, they had never been exposed to as well. Habitat change that can occur because of human activity. So we talked about global climate change and how it's changing the temperature of the water. So things like lobsters, they are having to go more north. If we look at, for instance, polar bears are moving down to get food source. The grizzlies are there, and so you're actually having them interbreed. So you're getting these hybrid species. We talked about global climate change also with the Panama golden frogs, and they get that thicker skin, and it's really decimated their population. Logging, obviously, you're removing habitat. Urban sprawl, we're removing habitats. Some animals adapt very well, like red-tailed hawks and coyotes. Others don't. They need that space. Monocropping, I just talked about, and then trawling for fish. You see how that's decimated this particular habitat. And then our last thing, geological and meteorological events that affect habitat. We have a couple up here. I didn't put up continental drift because you did that last year. So if continental drift, there's plenty of examples in continental drift altering various habitats and therefore affecting your ecosystem and your communities. El Nino events, this one from the 1990s, we have a decrease in the algae that killed 90% of the Galapagos marine iguanas, and they really altered their genetic diversity, and it caused a decrease in their body size. So you can see this is pre-El Nino, and then you can see post. And oh, look, there's our confidence interval bars. So this is the ones that we find statistically significant where they don't overlap with a 55% confidence interval. And then the KT extinction, that's the meteor that hits the Yucatan Peninsula. And that caused the dinosaurs to go extinct due to the change in the habitat, right? It got colder, they had less sunlight was getting to the earth, less photosynthesis. That opened up for us ecological niches, so mammals could fill those in and start to diverge and become different species. If you don't remember the KT extinction and the Alvarez hypothesis, again, there's a really good HHMI, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, movie on that. That's free for you to watch. I think it's about 30 minutes, called The Day the Mesozoic Died. And they kind of go over that. So if you don't recall that from last year, I know we talked about it very briefly this year just because you do that in our science. All right, and so that is the end of this podcast. Office hours are open, but please feel free to also email me with any questions. We will next week do a quiz for ecology, since it would be considered an open note quiz. And we will be moving on to doing the botany lectures. And then eventually I want to incorporate some of those virtual labs, especially for ECE, so that we can show that we're doing some type of lab program as well during this time. okay? And if you did not finish your ecology reading, you did see the biogeochemical cycles from Bozeman, please do that so that you're well prepared for your AP exam. We have some, we'll see what's happening with that hopefully in the near future.